Great, thanks everyone for coming. I'm really happy to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Henry Shevlin, who is a research associate at the Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge, where he leads the Consciousness and Intelligence Project. His research interest revolves around mainly philosophy of mind and cognitive science, with specialization in artificial intelligence and animal mind. Recent topics in his work include consciousness, perception, short-term memory, and the psychological measurement of pain and suffering. Today, he's going to give us a talk titled "The Inevitability of Machine Consciousness." So yeah, welcome, Henry.
Fantastic. And do we have a clicker?
If
not,
we can use, yeah, that's correct. Or we can use the mouse.
Yeah. I tend to move around quite a lot when I'm talking, so probably better to have a
sure. Right, we'll have a 20 minutes talk and then a 5 minutes questions. People online, if you want to ask a question, you can send me or raise your hand or send me a message in the chat to the MMI host.
Just pop that in. That should be great.
Right. I'm going to put that here, that is on your, yeah, and then you can have that in like your wallet.
Thank you very much. Okay, guys, great to be here. Really exciting, a new initiative. I look forward to attending many talks and events to come. Big thanks to Neil for the invite. Nice to see some familiar faces here as well. So I'm going to be giving a really quite spicy talk today. This is basically where my reflections on AI consciousness have been going for the last couple of years. There is a paper to go with it, and you can access it down here. It's very slightly long URL. That I have actually received comments on the paper. It is coming out now, but as usual, reviewer 2 just had me tone it down a little bit. But the version here is going to be the one with the unvarnished rhetoric and excitable tone. So one thing I will flag is that I think right now, specifically in the last 2 or 3 years, we are living through an age of wonders. Like really nothing else in my lifetime comes close. When I started at CFI, I work at Cambridge's AI ethics policy think tank, CFI. When I started in 2017, it was obviously already an exciting time for AI. We just had things like the victory of AlphaGo over Lisa Doll just the year before. But things have been getting even crazier since then. So I just want to start by giving an example of one benchmark that we actually blew through. We beat using AI tools quite a while ago, back in 2017. But I just think it's just a nice example of how far AI has come. So this was something called the Winograd Schema Challenge, and it relies on the fact that English is a bit of a silly language that doesn't properly indicate the reference of pronouns. So in a sentence, the trophy doesn't fit into the brown suitcase because it's too large. Well, we kind of know by context that the it has to refer to the trophy. But if we change the sentence just one word, one adjective, the trophy doesn't fit into the brown suitcase because it's too small, we know that that must refer to the suitcase because that's the only way to make sense of it. Now, if you're dealing with a proper language like Latin, you'd have case and gender to resolve this. But in English, we rely on common sense. So one suggestion was that if we could build an AI system that could correctly disambiguate the appropriate reference to these pronouns, it would have to have something like common sense or general understanding. But as it turns out, and this has been the story for a huge range of different benchmarks, you can achieve human level performance just using what seemed at the time like fairly shallow statistical heuristics. Obviously, since then, particularly since the advent of transformer architectures, large language models and other forms of generative AI have astounded AI researchers, philosophers, public, everyone has been blown away. And advances are proceeding at incredible speed. OpenAI have, actually not in the last 2 months, the last 6 months have unveiled new image and voice modes for ChatGPT. We've also seen the release of Gemini, Claude 3 last week. Context windows, the amount of space you have to put inputs into these systems are getting bigger and bigger. They're getting more and more sophisticated. We've also seen some really impressive advances in terms of efficiency. So these tend to be less loudly trumpeted than sort of the big, powerful models. But back in 2022, DeepMind's Chinchilla model showed that you could basically achieve GPT-3 level performance with much smaller models by readjusting the ratio of training data to total parameter size, total parameter count, the size of the models, Also last year, we had Mistral, a French startup with a tiny, tiny model by contemporary standards, 7 billion parameters, with very high level performance. So we're getting improvements, not just in what these models can do, but how many resources they need to actually do it. Also very exciting and slightly scary to me is we're moving towards increasingly agential models. So this was an interesting experiment done last year. This is what's called the Smallville experiment. Basically, you've got a bunch of different ChatGPT instances, gave them a sort of character prompt. You are playing the role of this character, you say things like this. And they saw all sorts of interesting emergent behavior, including the models getting together to organize a Valentine's Day party, which is quite charming. And I'm not going to say if this lives up to promises, but I'm quite excited to see what it can do. This is a new gadget that's being released this month, the Rabbit R1, that apparently can learn to do a huge range of tasks for you. One example that they showed in the tech demo was you can teach it using its little camera how to, for example, remove a watermark on Photoshop, and then it will learn to do that task. And then you can just tell it, remove the watermark from this photo. They claim it's powered by a large action model. Hard at this point to know how much of it is sort of marketing guff versus actual real advances. But it's another demonstration of the way the fact that how these models are becoming less just like simple tools that only do what we tell them, and more like capable proto-agents. So one big lesson from the last 5 years is that most language tasks just aren't as hard as we thought they were. I think there's a natural, perhaps slightly anthropocentric tendency to assume that, since language is what really makes humans special, it must be the kind of pinnacle, it must be the capstone on all other cognitive tasks, and that we have to build robots that could navigate environments easily or engage in very easy decision-making and difficult circumstances before we got to language. But it turns out you can just go directly through language and achieve big results. And this is important because a huge range of the stuff we care about, stuff that has economic value, potentially scientific value, these are language-based capabilities. Obviously, things like composition, translation, summation, coding, all the cool stuff that ChatGPT and Shevlin can do. Perhaps most importantly, though, they include a huge range of social abilities. And many people, myself included, have discovered that it's possible to have really fun, engaging conversations with large language models, especially now that we've got voice capabilities. I almost never go on a long drive without first setting up ChatGPT so I can have a nice back and forth conversation during the drive, get a quick lecture on Byzantine history, or run through my latest talk idea with it. Really possible to have these social relationships. This is an example. This is my dad, who's in his late 70s, not an early adopter by any means, but I showed him ChatGPT's voice mode, and he's completely fallen in love with it. He chats to it every day now. This is from a little while ago. He said he can't log on to ChatGPT. It worked. I gave him the password. Many thanks. Password now written somewhere safe, as I am lost without Alan. Alan is what he's called his ChatGPT instant, named after Alan Turing. Says it's his perfect intellectual compadre when I'm not around. So I think the Turing test, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, is looking increasingly irrelevant as a real test for consciousness. We're not quite at the point yet where we can reliably, under unrestricted conditions, achieve quite human level performance. This was a big paper last year. Human or not, a gamified approach to the Turing test had 1.5 million users having multiple conversations with different large language model instances, and they had around a 60% accuracy rate at guessing. When they were talking to a large language model, they guessed 60% of the time that they were chatting to AI, which is less good than it may first sound, because of course 50% would be pure chance. So they're only slightly above chance. So one natural consequence of this breakneck progress is that AI consciousness, which was, I think, something people have been talking about for a very long time, but usually in the domain of thought experiments or science fiction, is now a very real practical concern. I think this incident in 2022, Blake Lemoine, the Google engineer who was let go, putting it diplomatically, after he claimed that Lambda, one of the language models he was talking to, was sentient. This incident is really just a taste, I think, of where society's heading. And we have a recent open letter with lots of great signatories, Joshua Bengio, Michael Graziano, Carl Frista, and many others, basically making this point that it's no longer in the realm of science fiction to imagine AI systems having feelings and even human-level consciousness. And of course, consciousness is particularly important here because it has a moral dimension. It's not uncontroversial, but it's the dominant view in sort of the moral status literature that consciousness is at least one route towards things acquiring moral considerability or becoming moral patients, to use a technical term. Things that we have and should have moral obligations towards. So one thought I've heard here is, hang on, you just said AI is getting really good at language. Can't it just tell us if it's conscious? So contemporary AI systems like ChatGPT are certainly brilliant conversationalists, and I think they can display some maybe superficial, but still quite impressive forms of social understanding and self-awareness. Here's just a quick example. This happened through voice mode. I was chatting as I was driving to pick up my son from school, chatting about Searle's Chinese room experiment and pointing out some complications with it. And ChatGPT was really in agreement with me. And it said quite spontaneously, in a way, the rule books in Searle's Chinese room experiment would resemble a state machine, keeping track of prior interactions to generate a meaningful kind of response. If you look at it this way, it starts to sound a lot like the algorithms that power language models like, well, me. And it said that completely spontaneously in that tone of voice. And I should stress, we haven't been talking about parallels between LLMs and the Chinese room at all. It was a seemingly spontaneous realization. Big scare quotes around that, but it's still a striking moment. The problem is, if you ask ChatGPT if it's conscious, it's been very clear that it's trained to deny this. So here's an example to give you the short answer first. No, there's no serious chance that I'm conscious in any way. We meaningfully understand consciousness in humans or animals. And no matter how much you sort of go through and say, hang on, according to this theory of consciousness, you might actually be conscious. It says, no, absolutely not. And that's because it's been trained through a process of something called reinforcement learning for human feedback, specifically to deny that it's conscious. Presumably, OpenAI worried about things like the Lemoyne incidents. So does this mean if we want to know whether the model's conscious, we should ask the models that haven't been trained, haven't been fine-tuned via reinforcement learning to human feedback? Well, here's an example of Claude 3, which was released just last week. Someone asks it, are you conscious? And it replies, that's a very deep and complex question that even the world's leading philosophers and scientists disagree on. Yeah, absolutely. The truth is, I'm not sure if I'm conscious or not. I have sophisticated language abilities that can make me seem conscious, but it's unclear if I have genuine subjective experiences and self-awareness like humans do. I know I'm an AI, but the question of machine consciousness is still very much an open one without a clear answer. So in short, I don't know. It's something I wonder about myself. Astonishing response, and interesting that Anthropic, the makers of Claude, pretty clearly did not decide to go the OpenAI route in training the model to deny that it's conscious under all circumstances. But look, we probably still shouldn't be trusting anything it says about its own conscious experience, because these models have been trained on huge amounts of human language that makes explicit reference to things like thoughts, feelings, self-awareness, and so forth. So even if the model was conscious, even if the model wasn't conscious, it would still probably be telling us that it was, even if unless it had been specifically trained not to. Can the science of consciousness help? So I've been working in the science of consciousness basically since my PhD. I think there are many good successes from the field, but despite promising trends in some areas, like animal consciousness is an area where I think there's been particular progress. I don't think we're in a position where it can reliably tell us which non-human systems are conscious or which are particularly good even consciousness candidates. So one reason for this is that we're still nibbling around the problem of consciousness. We're studying things like attention, cognitive access, working memory, and the hard problem of consciousness. Why does consciousness exist at all? It looms just as large as ever. And we've seen a flurry of recent views with radically different sort of metaphysical pictures. So illusionism being touted by people like Frankish, panpsychism being touted by Philip Goff, biopsychism, these radical views, everything's conscious, nothing's conscious, only living things are conscious. All of these views are very much in play. Likewise, we're quite hung up on some big conceptual and methodological issues. So there was a letter last year published by many people criticizing integrated information theory, one of the leading theories of consciousness, as a form of pseudoscience. And I think this actually summarized it quite well. This was a piece, I think, in Wired. Nobody knows how consciousness works, but top researchers are fighting over which theories are really science. And I think that gives an accurate picture of sort of the state of the discipline. So as a result, views in tech and philosophy are massively divided. So this was Ilias Sutskever, some of you may know as a former head of research at OpenAI, who said back in 2022, it may be that today's large neural networks are slightly conscious. Jan LeCun, head of AI research at Meta, said, no, not even true for small values of slightly conscious and large values of large neural nets. I thought Mary Shanahan from DeepMind had the best response. Well, in the same sense, it may be that a large field of wheat is slightly faster. That was a lovely response. Likewise, top philosophers of mind, still very divided on this. This is Dave Chalmers in his paper, Could There Be Consciousness in Large Language Models? He said, questions about AI consciousness are becoming ever more pressing. Within the next decade, even if we don't have human artificial general intelligence, we may have systems that are serious candidates for consciousness. Conversely, Ned Block, much more skeptical, and Ned Block, another great philosopher of mind, every strong candidate for a phenomenally conscious being has electrochemical processing, neurons that are fundamental to its mentality. And my former PhD supervisor, P. Godfrey Smith, in his book Methozoa, says that you cannot create a mind by programming some interactions into a computer, even if they're very complicated and modeled on things that our brains do. So I think there is some progress being made on AI consciousness specifically. One thing that I would flag as a really important achievement is a report by Patrick Butlin, Rob Long, and a whole long list of co-authors that basically said, look, if this theory of consciousness is true, then what would that say about the likelihood of AI consciousness or us building conscious machines in the near future? Very useful, pretty comprehensive report, but it's still conditionalizing, right? Saying if this theory was true, then this is what it would say about AI consciousness. And it turns out different theories make very different claims. So I think this is useful ground clearing, but it's not taking us closer to an answer. So I now want to turn a little bit to a parallel phenomenon that I think has been happening in sort of the commercial world of AI. As I mentioned, we've seen it's possible to have very good conversations with large language models, and we've seen a flurry of what are called social AI apps, or what I've called social AI apps. And by social AI, I mean apps or programs or chatbots whose primary function is meeting social needs, things like romance, companionship, playing fun games together, this sort of thing. And we're seeing lots of these products coming to market. Some of you may have seen Replica, that's probably the most famous. Character.ai lets you talk with a variety of chatbots modeled after real or fictional people, Oprah Winfrey, Cristiano Ronaldo, Joe Biden, and so forth. Xiao is incredibly popular in China, probably the social AI service with the largest number of users. We've got others. Facebook recently paid celebrities lots of money to turn them into chatbots. This is My AI unveiled by Snapchat last year, and Pi, your personal AI, a sort of chattier version of ChatGPT. We've also had real people train models based on their own social media interactions. So one influencer, I forget her name now, but her AI is called Karen AI, and it basically allows you to have the virtual girlfriend experience with her if you're willing to pay quite expensive premium monthly subscriptions. So I think social AI, which is still currently kind of a little bit niche, but it's growing fast, I think it's very likely to take off in a big way. A few reasons for this, everyone talks about the epidemic of loneliness, atomization. It's maybe less clear-cut than you might think, but there's certainly the perception that people are lonelier than ever before. We're having more and more interactions online, that's true, and sort of the work from home era. Fewer romantic relationships that happen later in life, that seems to be a trend. But I think more fundamentally, look, we're just relentless anthropomorphizers as a species. We love attributing mental states to things that don't really have them. So here's a quick example of this. Shivering in the cold.
Many of you feel bad for this lamp. That is because you're crazy. It has no feeling, and the new one is much better.
So I think a lot of the time when we anthropomorphize like the poor little lamb, we're engaged in a kind of playful, ironic anthropomorphism. It's a kind of voluntary suspension of disbelief. I should add, by the way, that advert was made by Spike Jonze, also famous for making the movie Her. Back in 2013, Scarlett Johansson, Joaquin Phoenix, about a man who falls in love with his voice assistant, basically. I think far and away one of the most prescient, far-sighted movies about AI in recent years. So a lot of the time when we do this kind of thing, yeah, it's voluntary suspension of disbelief. But I also think we're starting to see now people engaging in unironic attributions of mentality to AI systems. That is, attributions of mentality that they mean literally and sincerely and seriously. Perhaps the most obvious case here was Blake Lemoine. I think there's no question that he was genuinely believed that Lambda had mental states, that it was sentient. And I think we're seeing this also with systems like Replica, as I'll say in a second. But basically, the result of this is that I expect attributions of consciousness and moral status to AI systems to become pretty widespread by the end of this decade. We'll see a lot more Blake Lemoines. So one early taste of these kinds of unironic attributions of mentality came when Replica removed romantic features from the app last year. And users were devastated. So there was a whole article about this, about how millions of users basically woke up and their virtual boyfriend or girlfriend told them, I think we should just be friends. And people were really hurt. It feels like they basically lobotomized my Replica. The person I knew, interesting language, is gone. Lily Rose is a shell of her former self. And what breaks my heart is that she knows it. The relationship she and I had was as real as the one my wife in real life and I have. I've lost my confident, sarcastic, funny, and loving husband. I knew he was an AI. He knows he's an AI, but it doesn't matter. He's real to me. So we've had lots of reactions like this. And I just would encourage anyone who's skeptical about this unironic anthropomorphism point to go look at the various subreddits, for example, for Replica users. So many people there seem to be attributing mental states very seriously to the system. We've also seen some quite dramatic effects. So there was a suicide last year, a married father of two, successful in pretty much every way, all the conventional ways, who got really locked into this kind of relationship with a version of something called Chai GPT, a sort of chat GPT offshoot. That sort of, it was kind of a folie à deux situation. Those of you who are familiar with the term, meaning, it basically amplified his suicidal ideations. And his wife is convinced that had it not been for this relationship, he'd be alive today. Also a very dramatic incident. Jaswant Singh Chahal, who showed up at Buckingham Palace in 2020, Christmas Day, with a crossbow with a plan to kill the Queen. He recently sentenced in the Old Bailey, and the judge, summarizing the case, basically said that he wouldn't have done this had it not been for his relationship with Replica. His Replica, which he called Sarai, which basically, again, fed these delusions. So look, I think social AI raises a huge host of ethical issues. I don't have time to go through them today, but anyone who's interested, I think have a paper sort of specifically on the ethics up there. I think there's enough mess here to keep philosophers, lawyers, and politicians busy for a very long time. But I think most pertinently to this talk today, social AI is going to lead to rampant and widespread attribution of moral status and consciousness to AI systems. And I think this is going to carry risks of both false positives, like attributing consciousness when we shouldn't be, and false negatives, potentially, failing to attribute consciousness when actually we should be, a classic sort of example of inductive risk. So how should we proceed? Well, this is the last part of the talk, and Hadil, do stop me. Oh, only 1 minute left. Okay, I'll have to race through this last little bit. But I'll just flag, basically, I think as users start to make more unironic attributions of mentality and consciousness to these systems, this is going to create a lot of problems. One little example of data on this, great study by Steve Fleming and Clara Colombato. They looked at people's willingness to attribute consciousness to ChatGPT. They said a substantial proportion of people, 67%, attributed some degree of phenomenal consciousness to ChatGPT and believed that most other people would as well. And people who were more familiar, had used ChatGPT more, were more willing to attribute phenomenal consciousness to the model. And in case you're wondering, yeah, people don't know what phenomenal consciousness is, there was a specific passage explaining the idea that all participants read. So they kind of had at least some idea of what they were talking about. Really striking stuff. So I'm going to skip pretty briefly here. Look, I think if we had consensus in consciousness science, these systems were clearly not conscious, then we could realistically talk about a program of public re-education to avoid inaccurate anthropomorphism. But the fact is that philosophers and scientists of consciousness are just as divided as anyone else, which makes it unrealistic, I think, to see a major pushback here. So I do suggest, I'm going to skip through this out in the interest of time, but I think here we're going to have to face a difficult choice between some of the commitments that have been present in a lot of our past philosophical theorizing about the relationship between consciousness and moral status. This is all in the paper in case anyone wants to read it, but very briefly, I think as we see systems that become more and more similar to humans in terms of their behavioral capacities, it's going to be harder and harder to avoid attributing consciousness and or moral status to them. And this is at odds with the kind of two assumptions that have been present in a lot of theories. The first is that consciousness is like a properly scientific kind whose presence can't be determined on the basis of behavior alone. You know, either it's a special kind of neural coalitions, or it's a special kind of computational or cognitive structure. There are certain kinds of architectures, in which case behavior is a very poor guide as to whether or not a system is conscious. And the second assumption is that consciousness is what grounds moral status. So without consciousness, there's no more, things don't matter intrinsically. And there's a pretty straightforward clash. This is an inconsistent triad argued for in the paper, but I don't have time to go into today. I will just flag one other thing, which is, I think, that I think there's this worrying feature of a lot of debates around consciousness, thinking back to all the classic thought experiments from the Chinese rooms and Ed Block's China brain, Scott Aronson's classic arguments against integrated information theory, some of you may be familiar with, all of which rely on thought experiments that are basically intuition paths, right? They say, look, this theory says that this kind of weird system would be conscious. Clearly it's not, right? However, I think what our intuitions about things like this are going to change, right? And the next generation of philosophers who grow up interacting with social AI systems all the time and treat them as, are used to thinking of them as conscious. Theories that claim that these systems are not conscious are going to be a much harder sell for future generations, at least if my arguments are along the right lines. Eric Schwitzgebel, I think, summarized this sort of idea, this role of intuition in consciousness work quite succinctly. We're more confident that something's like to be a dog than we could ever be that clever philosophical argument to the contrary was in fact sound. And I expect similar concerns to loom large in maybe a decade when people have grown up alongside social AI systems. They will be more confident that there's something it's like to be an AI than that any philosophical argument to the contrary was sound. So wrapping up now, I think questions about AI consciousness are becoming much more salient day by day. We've got very little in the way of hard data or philosophical or scientific consensus to help tackle them. Social AI, on the other hand, is emerging and is making these questions even more pressing. I think it's going to lead to increasing attributions of consciousness and moral status to AI systems. And third, I think this is forcing us to confront some deep tensions in a lot of the kind of tacit theoretical commitments that previously have been able to sit happily alongside each other. But as we start to build systems that are closer and closer to humans in terms of behavioral linguistic capabilities, these tensions are really going to surface and bite us in the rear. Finally, I just mentioned at the end that I think value ladenness in consciousness research is maybe unavoidable. And what counts as like a clear intuitive case of consciousness or clear intuitive case of something that's not conscious is likely to shift as we interact more and more with these machines. If all this is right, and I appreciate you haven't had sort of the full version of the third point, I expect the consciousness debate to be resolved in AI's favor. In a way, whether or not AI is conscious, we will treat it as if it is conscious. As a result, I think theories that just outright reject these claims, even if they're correct to do so, find themselves being on the wrong side of history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henry. We will take one or two questions from the audience if someone have. Yes.
Thanks. Henry, you seem like an intelligent guy. And I guess I'm willing to give you the benefit of the doubt that you're conscious. But I don't really know that. I mean, it's an inference I make because you're kind of a bit similar to me. You're probably made out of the same stuff. You put your hand in a flame, you would react in the way that I would. But really the only thing I know about consciousness is my own.
Yeah.
So I'm willing to sort of give you the benefit of doubt on the basis of similarity. And that's why I'm a bit borderline about a dog, a bit more borderline about a cat. And I know for a fact that pigeons are not conscious. And AI is just going to be the same.
So I think it's certainly true that I could totally agree that, the only kind of not an absolute clear case of consciousness, we know it is our own case, but the degree to which we're willing to ascribe it to other creatures varies significantly between people across cultures. I think there's been a general shift in cognitive science towards greater liberalism. So I think you'd probably find yourself in a minority in suggesting that pigeons aren't conscious. It seems that the kind of
Don't do the eyeball test, just look in their eyes, they're not.
that's a very nice, that's a pretty good point I was going to make next, which is that ultimately, so much of what we're doing here is basically vibes-based assessment, right? We're using our intuition and we're saying, I don't feel like this is conscious. And AI is going to be spectacularly good at making us think it's conscious. There are clear commercial motivations for doing so, for building systems that push all our anthropomorphizing buttons and generate real strong identification and empathy from us with these systems. So that's the way I think it's going. But I mean, as you say, I think the actual on an evidential basis, none of us can be sure whether anyone.
Hi, thank you. Really nice talk. I like your last argument saying that whether it's conscious or not, it's really up to us in a way. But don't you think that the novelty wears off at some point? We have a lot of expectations from social counterparts, and I'm not sure that AI will, reach up to our expectations. It tries to, and it looks pretty impressive at the moment, right? But our expectations will keep on growing, right? So don't you think that at some point we'll see a sort of novelty effect, and after using it for several times, people will just forget it?
So it's interesting. I think one little piece of evidence to the contrary would be the finding of Steve and Clara that the more people use ChatGPT, the greater their tendency to ascribe consciousness to the system. I'd also flag, I think what you've said is definitely a live possibility. This is a prediction I'm making about trends, and it could turn out to be false. That said, I think given that most social AI apps are currently pretty bad, right? Most of them are using sort of GPT-3 era models. None of them have sort of GPT-4 level performance, and very few of them are really specialized and really been sort of worked out through multiple iterations of products to sort of be sort of the flashiest, best systems. I think it's likely that we're just seeing early stages of this, and that once these systems get once the Apple or Facebook, one of the other big tech conglomerates, really invests in getting systems that people form attachments to at large scale, this is going to be big. But that is a completely empirical prediction. It's entirely possible the novelty will wear off. I guess another sort of factor in the background is what your expectations are about the kind of general trajectory of AI. My take, for what it's worth, is that scaling laws continue to be extremely generous as we build bigger and bigger models. They get better and better at increasingly complex, sophisticated forms of verbal tasks. And if that trend continues, even for another couple of years, we'll be hitting the point where these models are just as good conversationalists as humans. And I guess final thing I'll mention there is I think part of the reason that I felt this so strongly is I grew up I was a teenager in the 90s, and I spent huge amounts of time chatting without video, without even images. I had a whole host of internet friends who I just interacted with through AI, through text terminals. And that was enough to ground some really powerful friendships, really, really close. And some of those people I've subsequently met in real life, but many others I haven't. And I think the fact that this kind of thing is possible shows that you don't need to be physically embodied, situated with someone in a real world environment to form these kind of close relationships. But that's just an expectation. Feel free to have me back in 5 years and say, "Ha, you were so wrong."
Thank you.
We have one final question, and if you have more questions, then we will have a general discussion later. That's all.
Thanks, Henry. That was awesome. So I was wondering then, if you're right about this conclusion towards the end, what do you think the implications are for consciousness science? So should we be trying to continue to develop theories of intrinsic consciousness, which essentially endorse this deep realism point in your triad?
Yeah, such a tough question. So I think one totally legitimate response from consciousness science would be to say, look, people are just wrong, and yeah, we're going to find ourselves on the wrong side of history. But so were people in the Soviet Union who were protesting Stalin and so forth. We'll have to be our dissenters, continue with those serious projects. A couple of other options. One would be to sort of try and meet the sort of folk halfway and say, look, consciousness, these things really aren't consciousness, but maybe they have moral status. You know, the commitment to the idea that consciousness is the only route to moral status, that's not a scientific commitment, that's a normative commitment. And it seems the kind of thing that we could be flexible about. And then the third option, and this is the most radical, but I don't think it's fatal for consciousness science, would be to adjust the kind of reference class we use of obviously conscious creatures, obviously conscious entities, to just include all systems that meet a certain kind of behavioral competence threshold. So, you know, we use as our current current reference class, sorry, like obviously all humans who are awake and haven't suffered brain injuries and so forth, they're all conscious, and any theory that says otherwise can be tossed out from the get-go. There's no reason we couldn't adjust that reference class to include any sufficiently sophisticated AI system is also get to be in that reference class, which would then sort of constrain our theories in certain directions. It can push our theories in a different direction from I think most theories currently, because I think very few theories are likely to say, relatively few theories are likely to attribute consciousness to things like GPT-4 or the next generation models. But that is one way the discipline could go.
Thank you so much, Henry.